Daniel Vokey. I'm on faculty of the Department of Educational Studies here. I'm very honored to chair this panel on more environmentalisms, and certainly very honored to participate in the symposium on Indigenous knowledges and the environment. I'd like to begin by expressing my appreciation for the warm welcome extended to me since I've been here actually by the Musqueam First Nation, by Larry Grant. And I must say that the unfailing generosity and hospitality of the Musqueam people, particularly in light of the history and ongoing effects of colonization, is to me a great teaching. Really, I can't think of words to adequately express it. I'd also like to express appreciation for the efforts of all the sponsors and the organizers that made the symposium possible, in particular Handel, who invited participation from the Environmental Education Caucus, which is how I came to be here. In a minute, we'll say a brief word of introduction to the rest of the panel. We'll follow pretty much the same format as the previous panel, and each will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have questions and answers at the end. I do want to say that I don't have a PowerPoint, but I have a handout which I will distribute later. Know enough about teaching not to give it out at this point. And you will find on the first page, there's just a brief introduction to the Environmental Education Caucus in the Faculty of Education at UBC and some of its initiatives, a link to the website, and also the person to contact if you would like to email and be part of this sort of ongoing group. But I should acknowledge the work, first of all, of Marcia McKenzie, who was a postdoctoral faculty member here, who was very instrumental in getting the caucus off the ground. The ongoing leadership initiative of Mark Edwards, who's at the back, and also Nora Timmerman, who've really kept the Environmental Education Caucus going and the conversations going. I also would like to acknowledge the work of Charlene Morton, who has been coordinating the social responsibility and environmental sustainability. It's been a new cohort, the teacher education program, and that's been one of the key ways in which the Environmental Education Caucus has brought some of its work into the faculty. There are others. So on the flip side of the handout, you'll see a few references to an environmental scholar and activist and teacher, Joanna Macy. Because when I thought, what I might say by way of speaking to the topic of more environmentalism, as you may know from the little bio, I've been practicing Shambhala Buddhism, and I chose Joanna Macy because she is certainly inspired and incorporates teachings from Buddhism into her education, environmental education. I also chose Joanna Macy, although I know her work mostly indirectly by people who participate in her programs, because I think there are some important resonances between her work and themes in Indigenous knowledge. And the first one would be, of course, the teachings on interdependence and interconnectedness, which we've heard about today. Also recognition that the environmental crisis, which is linked to a number of other different kinds of major challenges in our environment, is also fundamentally a spiritual crisis. And so to address it will require some spiritual healing. And another key theme in her work is actually to undertake that healing and environmental work should begin from a clear intention, a positive intention, and a spirit of gratitude, which also I find very prominent in the First Nations teachings I've heard. So there's just a few links to her work and references to some of her better known works, Coming Back to Life and World is Love or World is Self. And finally, there's a reference to a piece of work of my own where I've looked a little bit at the conditions for productive conversation across radically different worldviews, conversations among people representing very different traditions and communities. And one thing I could say that I think has come up here is that in some sense there is no neutral territory. In fact, when I start my teaches by acknowledging the traditional territories of the Musqueam First Nation, particularly courses on ethics, is to acknowledge there is no neutral language about ethics or anything else. So in some sense, we have to learn to speak other languages, metaphorically and otherwise. So mindful of time, I'd like to turn now to our presentations. And we'll begin with Mariam Nababi, who's a doctoral student in the Department of Educational Studies, followed by Jordan Bergen, who is a visiting faculty member from New York University, finally from very Donald Krug, who's in curriculum studies. Again, I'll refer you to the program, which has short biographies, giving a little bit more on their background, and no doubt there are links to websites where you can learn even more about their amazing accomplishments and publications. So please be quick.
Thanks, Daniel. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the knowledge and wisdom that's in the room. It's been such a great learning experience for me during the course of the day to be taking in all the different perspectives and experiences that people have had. And I'd like to acknowledge that it's also very humbling to be a part of this panel. I think as a student, it's always really nice to be part of these discussions. So we've been talking a lot today about the relationship between Indigenous communities' knowledge, the environment, and a theme that's really been laced throughout for me has been the notion of justice. My presentation is titled More Than Environmentalism, Integrative Anti-Racism in Informing Environmental Justice, and it very much follows along the same theme. Can you hear me back there? Okay. So I'll be exploring environmental justice both in the American and Canadian context before drawing on the key ideas of integrative anti-racism to explore specifically the social dimension of environmental justice, being environmental racism, within a Canadian context. I suggest practical implications for an environmental justice that places anti-racism at the center, impacting citizenship engagement, decision-making, and broader social transformations, and namely giving voice to those communities which are most marginalized that we have been speaking about today. So what does environmental justice look like? It's based on the premise of building on the intersections between social and ecological concerns. It is uniquely situated as it straddles social justice and environmentalism, and I quote, does not treat the problem of oppression and social exploitation as separate from the rape and exploitation of the natural world. Environmental justice asserts that the social and ecological are intricately linked and that the health of one depends on the health of the other. Although environmental justice issues are not new to Canada, there remains very little critical literature in the area. A common understanding of environmental justice is that it's an acutely different concept than environmentalism. The weakness of mainstream environmental movements is that it has a tendency largely to avoid the politics of class and race, even with respect to local ecological issues. Environmental justice addresses not only the problems of inequity, especially racism, but also how they relate to procedural and structural aspects of public policy, distributive and restorative justice. As a response to environmental injustice, the global environmental justice movement primarily emphasizes minority group rights and has addressed a breadth of issues including non-sustainable development and globalization, transboundary waste trade, and environmental racism. Environmental racism specifically involves the denial of human rights, environmental protection, and economic opportunities to communities where people of color live and work. The obvious overlap between the broader area of environmental justice and the specifics of environmental racism cannot be separated from one another. Specifically, I will explore the social dimension of environmental justice, that being environmental racism. So in spite of Canada's historical past of racial exclusion, most famous of which are with the First Nations communities in Africville, factors such as Canada's celebratory position as a multicultural state, the growing cultural and racial diversity, and markedly different historical contexts than our neighbors to the south, have really diverted the attention of environmental justice as being a social justice issue. In Canada, the issues are generally taken up in the spirit of multiculturalism, and the underpinnings of the discourse are positioned around ensuring a right to a safe, healthy, productive, and sustainable environment for all. This position clearly fails to take into account social justice issues such as poverty, racism, sexism, and classism, and really this impedes the notion of what a sustainable environment is. Concerns specific to environmental justice are negated in the broader discourse of multiculturalism, as well as anti-racism. In more recent years, however, a number of grassroots initiatives have formed, though without much national recognition. One of these groups is the Anti-Racist Environmental Coalition that came out of York University. In the US, the movement is primarily taken up by communities of color threatened by industrial pollution and has resulted in networks and coalitions confronting private and governmental organizations. National level advocacy has resulted in the 1991 signing of the Principles of Environmental Justice. However, one area that remains largely contested in the US is whether environmental justice is a race-based issue or a class-based issue. So it's very much, the movement is very torn in those areas. So acknowledging this tension in the discourse is a reminder of how social issues are taken up differently in Canada than in the US, and serves as a useful point of entry for us to explore integrative anti-racism within a Canadian context. Integrative anti-racism is a concept formalized by George Day at OISE, and it addresses the problem of discussing the social constructs of race, class, gender, ability, and sexuality as exclusive and independent categories. It's an activist praxis that challenges hierarchical meta-narratives, and it problematizes the many forms of interlocking oppression. It acknowledges that different forms of oppression have different social effects. Singular exclusive constructs are not sufficient when it comes to explaining the diversity of human experiences of oppression. That's a quote by him. So integrative anti-racism draws on 6 ideas, which I will tap into some of, to explore environmental justice. The 6 tenets of integrative anti-racism are broadly an understanding of how social differences are articulated, accessing personal and experiential knowledge, understanding of how power and privilege work in our society, the saliency of race in anti-oppression discussions, exploring the global and political issues beyond just what's happening at a local level, and engaging in a progressive politics for social transformation, which I will be tapping into more at the end of the talk. So how the lived experience of individuals inform their engagement in politics of social change is central to integrative anti-racism. There's an understanding that space needs to exist for identity politics to be taken up by those who can speak from an authority of lived experience. Cases such as Canada's usurping of Indigenous peoples' lands and the blatant environmental racism of Africville situation that some of you may be familiar with in 1950s Halifax are by no means lost as part of the current discourse of racism. The knowledge, cognitive, and especially emotional and visceral of the communities affected has the capacity to elevate the discussion to a new plateau. It is in part for this reason that the grassroots environmental justice movements are so effective in the US. Environmental injustice persists openly and unapologetically, contrary to Canada, where the multiculturalism discourse has the potential to blanket environmental racisms, negating the possibility that the experiences of racism by individuals and communities may in fact be informed by environmental injustice. Perhaps most pertinent to the environmental justice discussion in Canada is the understanding and acknowledgement of how power and privilege implicate individual communities and resources. It is within the lingua franca of anti-racism that social power and economic advantage cannot be separated from one another, and that race is in fact the venom with which advantage and disadvantage are established. Low-income groups, most commonly racial minorities, are most severely affected by disease, high mortality rates, contaminated water and land, and industrial pollution, as we've been hearing about today as well. Race, strategically, is the main entry point through which social oppression can and must be understood. And as much as integrative anti-racism emphasizes this, it goes further to remind us that racism must not be subsumed or separated from other oppressions, as there lies a danger in victimization and lost ability to identify one's agency and power to affect change. Globally, the dominant paradigm of patriarchy, capitalism, and globalization feed into what George Day sums up as the feminization of poverty and the racialization of working class. Racial minorities are not only socially and economically impacted, they're also blamed for society's ills. The broader aspects of environmental justice have been incorporated into sustainable development discourse. However, there's no direct links made to social inequities in relation to the environment. The World Conservation Strategy, for example, has proposed sweeping recommendations to ensure that the well-being of the planet, in order to, quote, and I quote, secure the survival and well-being of all people. Yet there is no mention of the structures in place that marginalize many groups in society. In Canada, the institutional level discourse on environmental justice has included all three levels of government, though environmental justice is more so seen as a restorative justice issue, which focuses on repairing environmental damage as opposed to environmental justice as a distributive justice issue, which addresses social inequities in the distribution of resources. This is a site of tension and has had an immobilizing effect in terms of politically moving the agenda forward with a shared understanding of the politics of race within an environmental justice framework. Integrative anti-racism, in its capacity to power the engine of environmental justice, serves as an excellent foundation to take up environmental racism issues, as it ranges both from the very personal to the political. In our trans-global community, environmental racism has played out in terms of where waste dumps are located, to where minerals are extracted from, to what resources are provided to what communities. We live in an era where decisions and actions in one region can easily impact the social, spiritual, environmental, and economic well-being of peoples and land in another region. An environmental justice that places anti-racism at the center requires an agenda for both social and educational transformation. It requires a deep structural shift in how minority groups are viewed and valued in the public sphere. It must introduce a relationship of interdependence, as we heard Mona talking about this morning, where the worldviews and knowledges of traditionally marginalized people is acknowledged and celebrated. In achieving this, I suggest that three fundamental shifts occur. First, citizenship engagement and democracy, and by citizenship, I mean more social citizenship. So the pursuit of an environmental justice that places anti-racism at the center is a pursuit in building citizenship and a sense of belonging. It holds the possibility of being a tool for engagement and in the democratic process as individuals and groups forge allegiances with other groups to advocate for justice. It creates room for civil society to be engaged and informed with a wider scope of the issues and contributing to the decision-making process. Second, it creates justice at different levels. An environmental justice that places anti-racism at the center can act as a tool for engaging in distributive justice. Environmental racism is then not just about race, but also other injustices that intersect race, such as poverty, sexism, marginalization of immigrant communities and Aboriginal communities, unemployment, disability, and sexuality. This makes real the idea that all social projects are ecological projects, in as much as all ecological projects are social projects. Additionally, social justice is exercised in how governments exercise and foster public participation in areas such as immigration, environmental planning, and waste management policies. And third, transformative social change. An environmental justice that places anti-racism at the center creates a shift in how we view the underlying structures in which we have been schooled. The discourse of power and control is disrupted to engage in alternative ways of knowing, silence in these hegemonic structures that we're living in. This allows us to not just address the complexities of social identities as we've been exploring, but rather how these identities inform our relationship with the earth. It is based on a paradigm that explores the instrumental role of all living things, and specifically the role of human beings have in creating harmonious and sustainable relationships. So in as much as the discussion has centered around the social dimension of environmental justice, environmental racism, I would really be remiss to not at least mention the broader implications of environmental justice. In its truest sense, environmental justice challenges the very foundation of Western civilization. Specifically, it disrupts the dominant anthropocentric notions of the world as it is rooted in the idea that as humans, we're just one part of a much larger system. The dilemmas of patriarchy, the effects of colonialism, modernity, globalization, industrialization, amongst many others, are contributing factors to the ecological, spiritual, and social dilemmas of our time. We are faced with a hefty task of making sense of these tensions and how we can minimize both the cause and effects. A holistic approach to environmental justice builds a shared language for exploring complex interrelated issues regardless of the politics at stake. It affords opportunities for groups, regardless of their politics, to build stronger points of connection across issues and to further mobilize in disrupting dominant discourses and actions. And lastly, it affords the opportunity for traditionally marginalized voices to speak to the issues from a lens that's not often given a space to.
You will think that we planned this perfect segue from Miriam's paper to mine, but we didn't really. I've been doing work on culture and the environment for about 15 years, and in particular, in the area of cultural studies, which has been not quick to take up these issues, but I've been very interested in the interaction between representations or stories about nature and the history of colonialism. And I've done a lot of work on the representation of weather. So this part of this chapter that I'm going to read to you comes out of that research. It sort of takes up the challenge that Charles Menzies offered this morning, where we need to change our stories. So this is going back into the history to see how some of these stories arose. And I'd like to thank Handel and the sponsors of this conference for bringing us together and giving us a chance to hear these stories. The weather, like music, mediates between our physical and social bodies. Its rhythms and the rituals we construct around them shape what it means to be part of the social world, both within a particular time and space and across to other times and places as we imagine or remember them. Images of place are intimately tied to mythic or remembered notions of its weather. Our sense of what is desirable in the weather, like our response to music, seems perfectly natural, indeed to express a sensitivity to nature itself. But this mediation between individual and social bodies is itself shaped by many social and cultural forces and by changes in the weather itself. Some experts predict that global warming will make a more fecund Canada the center of empire in the next century. Since so much agricultural land is being paved over, at least where I live in Ontario, this prospect seems dubious. There is no doubt, however, that such transformations challenge our cultures and our relationship with the natural environment. The greenhouse effect could provide us northerners with some relief at an experiential level, if not in terms of political cognition. Scientists predict that the average annual temperature will rise from nearly 2 to 5 degrees in the coming decades, which is almost as much as our present global average temperature has increased since the last ice age. Winters will grow shorter and growing seasons longer. It's pleasant to think about warmer weather, but unpleasant to think about droughts, dry earth, dying animals, dwarfish plants, dust, and other agricultural disasters. This development carries important implications for culture north of the 49th. Canada is linked to weather through a powerful cultural history whose lasting narratives continue to shape memory and everyday practice. To understand how the story is told, we need to consider this history. As travel extended the reach of early modern science, the New World became the subject of considerable speculation in Europe about relations between character and environment. This was a new world, said one arrival, because the ancients had no knowledge of it. They meant their own ancients, obviously. From the 16th to the 18th century, European philosophers dedicated themselves to understanding connections between geography, migration patterns, distant cultures, and the foundation of human nature. Understanding relations between human dispositions and nature was said to be the new prerogative of princes, who could rule best by drawing on the expert advice of scholars versed in geography, to understand their subjects. According to the classification system advanced by such scholars, Europeans are capable and reliable in work, culture, and health because of their moderate climate, while those who live in more extreme climates are less able to moderate and control their lives and body politics. People from the north were thought to be, quote, bold but lack cunning. They are physically vigorous, simple, and straightforward, but frequently under the influence of Bacchus, unquote. People from the south were deemed to be cunning, superstitious, subtle, soft, and lacking in boldness. A temperate climate could be expected to produce temperate characters who are, like Goldilocks' third chair, just right. What was more logical, muses Clarence Blackett, than to interpret the spectacle of sleepy natives lying in the shade in the hot, warm climates as creatures held enthralled by their climate? The age-old ideas of environmental influence, far from being discredited, actually increased in effectiveness, not only in the voyages to the New World, but in the travels through Eurasia and in the reports about Persia and China. Giovanni Butero, whose 16th century publications established a pre-Malthusian approach to the study of populations, judged that people whose conditions were adversely influenced by climate could be altered and improved through the effects of music. Subsequent remedies were of a more pedestrian nature, which the Americans, despite their temperate climate, have been particularly anxious to employ. Given the ideological, political, not to mention racial significance of these ideas, writes one historian, the prospect of air conditioning was of immense importance. Here was a tool that will allow all humanity to progress beyond the accidents of climate. Of course, air conditioning has helped to produce its own accident of climate that has put the whole idea of progress under grave suspicion. Natural philosophers of the Enlightenment period were not expected to draw their knowledge of climate and character from local traditions. It was only later that settlers would be called upon to settle the country rhetorically rather than etymologically, as Paul Carter suggests in his beautiful study of language in Colonial Space. Spaces cleared for settlement in the New World had to be inhabited, and before they could be properly colonized, they had to be translated and made intelligible to the encroaching culture. This translation process was molded by the violence of colonial intervention. Even today, most Canadians remain ignorant of the oral and material traditions through which Indigenous cultures established and transmitted their knowledge of the environment. The challenges of climate change is an opportunity to create better dialogue and learning between different kinds of knowledge, which need all the help they can get. History has transformed the weather from medium, the wind carrying messages, to object, or even victim, of global capitalism, which has caused the wind to blow so catastrophically, the rain to fall so strangely, the water to seep so poisonously. Canada is in a special position to trace the history and implication of this colonization process. Citizens are forced to second-guess the premises of neoliberalism for the simple reason that people who sleep in the streets can die of the cold. Fantasies of control of nature, of control over nature are brought to earth by remote processes like the melting of the polar ice cap, but more locally by frostbite and fatal exposure, and the neoliberal dream of limitless mobility is frozen in its tracks. So is the environmental movement, according to some theorists, who claim that one reason there has been so much public indifference towards environmental politics is the movement's own tension between the dramatization of catastrophic threat and its banalization of personal everyday responses. Ironically, then, the environmental movement is thwarting itself by separating the environment into different component parts. It needs to learn better how to communicate between disaster and everyday life, a subject on which Indigenous knowledge has a great deal to say. Coming to terms with such questions could improve our understanding of the dilemmas of Canada's existence. From this reappraisal, a new anti-colonial, post-national collective self-consciousness can surely emerge. But have the evening TV weather reports said anything about the problematic improvement of the nation's climate? Will the TV forecaster say, good news for you, it's going to be very cold tomorrow? Will the newspaper's daily 50 years ago today column remind its readers of an earlier golden age of Arctic cold and nudge them into stoic protest against the colonizing intrusion of greater warmth with its accompanying rhetorics of profit and pleasure? Or will Canada's comprador bourgeoisie celebrate climate change on behalf of its potential fiscal benefits, renegotiating agricultural subsidy and trade agreements with the US, voicing platitudes about the manageable price of progress, and once again ignoring the extra economic ethics of the nation's destiny? Will the peoples of the North wield more power when their climate warms up? What happens when there is nothing left to hunt, when the ice cap melts away, when the Arctic becomes an oil drill, a speedy route for shipping goods to Asia, or even a war zone? When it comes to climate, the media instructs us continuously in an apoliticizing, narcissistic, and xenophobic construct of pleasure. Living as we do in the shadow of the world's most powerful technocracy of sensuality, what could affection for this natural habitus reveal other than a masochistic toleration for inferior conditions? Wouldn't any normal person prefer Florida? Before weather forecasting became an everyday ritual in broadcasting, weather prediction was the subject of everyday readings of natural signs. The color of the evening sky, the direction and force of the wind, the behavior of animals and insects, the sound of the trees, the distance covered by ordinary sounds. Knowledge of local weather was transmitted through generations in the form of rhymes, proverbs, and mythic figures. These were supplemented by the reading of barometers, which were widely available to Europeans by the 18th century. The shortcoming of such weather lore was not inaccuracy. Weather literature is replete with stories of scientists being shown up by local oral tradition. In the wake of the tsunami, it was revealed that one Indonesian island community survived without casualties because their culture of traditional storytelling told them what the winds meant, and they were able to move off the beaches and up onto the hills. Traditional observation of natural science produces short-term predictions as reliable as modern meteorological forecasting, as climatologists themselves concede. Quote, "A ring around the sun or moon brings snow or rain real soon," says Environment Canada's senior climatologist, is 70% right, almost as good as Environment Canada. This limitation produces a natural ambivalence in viewers whose desire for prediction is punctured with the knowledge that the weather will cheat the forecasters and do what it wants. Obviously, an economy built on predictability cannot rely on traditional knowledge, for such forecasts rarely extend reliably past a couple of days. Indeed, an improved capacity to predict was a fundamental precondition for the emergence of modern capitalism. The task of gathering weather observations simultaneously in a number of places originated briefly in the 17th century, but was undertaken regularly after 1780. To extend the temporal range of weather prediction and to respond to the needs of travelers and scientists, rapid communication across space became a prerequisite. So I'm just going to skip over this, but to say that the telegraph became very important because if you couldn't convey the information about storms, let's say moving from the west to the east, faster than the storm itself, then your knowledge didn't have much usefulness. So I have a whole history of weather TV forecasts here, but I'll skip over it. Take about another hour. I want to resituate this truncated history of predictive technologies in the context of colonial history. Journals written by explorers and missionaries who traversed the North on behalf of European church and state reveal the difficulties of their encounters. A Jesuit missionary named Paul Lejeune wrote of, quote, "the great trials that must be endured by those who cross over the seas in order to seek and to instruct the savages," unquote. In a 1634 passage entitled "What One Must Suffer in Wintering with the Savages," Lejeune describes the ordeal of navigating between the suffocating smoke and the pitiless cold, between famished dogs and disagreeable foods, compelled all the while to sleep and drink and walk, plunged to the knees in the snow. This would not have been novel information for his readers, as French official circles, thoroughly committed to the establishment of a new France, had already learned of the severity of Canadian winters and the superiority of Indigenous housing in surviving them. In fact, the French were committed to the conceit that climate determined character and maintained a strong belief in cold's beneficial effects upon the health and strength of its subjects. They were not freezing to death in the midst of it. Missionaries like Lejeune shaped their journals to recreate the circumstances in New France in a manner conducive to the adoption of desired courses of action. That meant he had to depict the indigene, whose soul remained the mission's professed object, as at once savage and capable of redemption. By describing the savages as both difficult and redeemable, the missionary hoped to convince his superiors of the ability to struggle for their souls in competition with their own spiritual leaders. Perhaps thoughtful of such considerations, Lejeune averts any suspicion of petulance by writing about how he had given away the mantle off his shoulders along with some other available comforts under the evil and covetous gaze of the sorcerer. This powerful member of the community insisted on playing prophet, amusing these people by 1,000 absurdities, which he invented, in my opinion, every day. I did not lose any opportunity of convincing him of their nonsense and childishness, exposing the senselessness of his superstitions, unquote. We do not learn what those superstitions were, nor how Lejeune could detect their sudden invention. Now this was like tearing his soul out of his body, for as he could no longer hunt, he acted the prophet and magician more than ever before in order to produce his credit, Lejeune writes, and to get the dainty pieces. Evidently this battle concerned the just allotment of food, but it was conducted most vigorously if we are to believe Lejeune's account on the terrain of language. Well, how's my time?
5 minutes.
I'll do my best. Leaving both protagonists very exasperated. Lejeune's artful account was informed supposedly by first-hand knowledge of the languages and customs of the indigenous populations. His journal informs church authorities that the language of the savages was full of scarcity on matters of piety, devotion, and virtue, and on theology, philosophy, and mathematics. All words, quote, which refer to the regulation and government of a city, province, or empire, unquote, along with justice, flowers, punishment, kings, science, and wealth. These were words that were absent from their vocabulary. By noting the lack of words for these spiritual obligations, the missionary communicates the belief that he himself is guided by them. In other areas, richness prevailed in, quote, the tongue of our savages, note the plural possessive of the pronoun. Their vocabulary altered in accord with different kinds of substantives, thus, forgive my horrible pronunciation, yielding entirely different terms for cold, tabasco asini, the stone is cold, takabisisunupuagan, I'm not even going to try anymore, my tobacco pipe is cold, this tobacco is cold, and moving to larger objects, this dog is cold, and so on. Quote, and thus you see a strange abundance, observes the author, which both impresses and depresses the visitors in their attempts to influence the savages. The saying that Eskimos, sick, have many words for snow is a commonplace among school children, for whom images of people wrapped in parkas provide an index of quaint and childlike adaptability to their inhospitable terrain. The problem is that these children, like Lejeune, are mistranslating, and not just in the name they give to the Inuit people. They are trying to understand the prolific descriptive resources of the Inuit in terms of a functional nominalism parallel to their own, or our own, as though there could not exist any fundamentally different spirit of naming. English language terms for snow have a quantitative and instrumental purpose, which is to encourage us to continue our business with as little delay as possible. They convey how difficult it will be to get to work, how far its excesses might go in immobilizing us or relieving us from our duties, what the sports conditions are, and in extreme situations threatening to turn us into irresponsible citizens, not showing up for work, unable to drive our cars, mutually carrying in the streets, in its own willful image. White language does not grant independent agency to the elements. Other ways of naming the snow represent a childish inability or refusal to subjugate nature in the appropriate manner. We learn that a technology of everyday life without a plan for mastery of the elements is no technology at all. I'm going to skip now to my conclusion if I can find it. Okay, I'm just going to give you my conclusion now. In colonial explorers' encounters with native cultures, they struggled to adapt to the conditions they encountered, while at the same time claiming the right to possess the land. Journals of first contacts, like those of Lejeune and Mercier, which is another one I discuss here, offer vivid descriptions of such difficulties. Their struggle to accommodate their experience of the landscape was voiced in a language that was imposed upon it. Having participated in, quote, unhoming indigenous protocols and ontologies through perpetual colonialism, as Rabinder Sedab, a PhD student at York, puts it, they could not actually celebrate the ontology of physical resourcefulness, collective interdependency, and environmental knowledge that was shaped around it. Indeed, colonial culture did its best to eliminate any naturalistic reference to nature, and only permitted its return when representational conventions had been properly tamed by American and European landscape painting, romantic frontier literature, and the TV weather forecast. This history poses both old and new questions. The wind carries messages, but they are not the same messages. The land has meanings, but these meanings have changed as nature struggles under intensities of exploitation that could not have been imagined a century ago. It is not the task of Indigenous people to reassure other, newer cultures about any unchanging nature or unchanging culture. Quite the opposite, for Indigenous peoples know best how this change occurs. We must learn together to draw on and to develop all kinds of knowledge and space in order to heal not only the land, but also the troubled relationships between past and present, between spirituality and science, exploitation and nature, established cultural practices, and contemporary ecological realities. It is an honor for me to be invited to participate in this process today, and I thank you for listening.
Can I get everybody just to stand up for a second? Just stretch a little bit. I don't know about you, but I sure needed to. And then when you're ready, you can have a seat.
What if you're not ready?
That's okay. I need to get one thing out of my hand over here, and I figured it would give me an opportunity. Well, I would like to thank Musqueam people and the organizers of the conference for this opportunity to speak with everyone. I have this 25-page paper that I'm not going to read, and my interests are primarily around how do we become more actively involved in doing something about what it is that is going on in the world, and what can we do with our young people in particular. I spend a lot of time reading theory, and I love theory, but I also really like the idea that we need to be proactive in trying to figure out how those ideas can be used with our children. How can we take that and move it into the curriculum that we're teaching within our schools? And so what I'd like to do is just share with you some of the kind of ideas associated with these kinds of things, specifically around ecology, culture, and what it would mean for us to kind of use it within the schools. So I'm actually going to show you 4 little videos that I think tell a story from someone else's perspective that I think is a way of talking about this. And I was really influenced doing this when I saw this cover for Time magazine that, you know, we are, you know, the people of the year, right? That you are. How many of you are familiar with YouTube? How many have actually gone on YouTube and looked at some of the videos? How many people are teachers? Good. Administration? Okay. Others? I like saying that. Others? I want to talk a little bit about ideas around this particular commercial.
For each of us, there's a moment of discovery. We turn a page, raise a hand, and just then, in the flash of a synapse,
You hear her back there?
we learn that life is elemental. And this knowledge changes everything. We look around and see the grandness of the scheme. Sodium bonding with chlorine, bonding with oxygen, hydrogen bonding with oxygen. We see all things connected. so obvious, its presence is simply understood. The missing element is the human element, and when we add it to the equation, the chemistry changes. Every reaction is different. Potassium looks to bond with potential. Metals behave with hardened resolve. And hydrogen and oxygen form desire. The human element is the element of change. It gives us our footing to stand fearlessly and face the future. It is a way of seeing. It gives us a way of touching issues, ambitions, lives. The human element. Nothing is more fundamental. Nothing more elemental.
Oh, by the way, it's a commercial from Dow. I really was taken back when I saw it because I just thought it was so moving. I was really intrigued with the fact that these images and the message, the story spoke to me. And I thought that it was such a powerful message that was being sent out that I wanted to know more. I wanted to know more. And I thought that it's really important that when we look at the kinds of ideas that are being presented to us, that we think about ways of articulating those ideas within the larger context. And so articulation is this idea of bringing together all kinds of different ideas that don't necessarily have a connection, but you look for particular relationships between what might be those kinds of connections. And so rather than having any kind of finite method or any kind of particular way of doing something, it has to continue to change because the things that are around us, the ideas that are part of our lives, continue to change. And how can we make that then become part of this idea of how we teach? What are the kinds of words we can use to get people to engage in telling stories, constructing stories that would look at the way ideas are dominant in society, and what position do they come from? What are the kinds of ideas that emerge and that start to have a stronger presence and story, and what are the kinds of ideas that have a residual effect? These are terms that I think young people actually can grab hold of as a way to look at the kind of conceptual basis of what some of these kinds of ideas are. It's all based on this notion that any particular idea can be interpreted in a number of different ways. And so I'm assuming that most of you have seen these images before where you either see the vase or you see the faces. Anybody see just the faces? Vase? Both? Both. Yeah. And so this idea that things can be interpreted in a number of different ways simultaneously is a really good concept actually for our young people. And when we're dealing with these kinds of complex issues that don't have a particular idea or a particular answer, I think it's important that we look at ways to engage them in these kinds of ideas. I'm not an advocate for using technology for technology's sake. I think of language as a technology which allows us to express our ideas. I think of language and the written word as a technology. And so I see technology as some of the computer technology is also one of those kinds of extensions. However, I don't necessarily think because it's new or it's sexy or that it's something that is being promoted that we should actually be using it. But I do think that in some sense, if we're going to actually tap into these kinds of ideas and use them to help us to have a voice, that we should think about how they can become part of a curriculum that would help us to understand the world a little better. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these, but basically what it says is that, you know, the kind of visual information that we've had has moved from this idea of the thing representing the thing to the thing no longer representing the thing. And a good example of that would be to go to a movie nowadays, and you can basically see just about anything animated, any kind of environment that's been created. And so let me just go forward a little bit to kind of talk about how these ideas come together. This is several images that bring form of technology together with the human body. Okay, and I don't necessarily see there being a distinction between nature and culture. Nature is part of culture, and culture is part of nature. There is no, when we talk about going out into nature, this room, we're in nature right now. It's a constructed nature, but it is nature. And so this idea that we have these ways of representing nature and culture, I think become more sophisticated, to the point where sometimes in the kinds of ways that they're represented, where technology is placed in the environment, so you no longer see the technology because the technology becomes naturalized, causes this sense of mystification for people. They don't understand what the effect might be. And we need strategies to get at how it is we might understand, this juxtaposition of things that don't necessarily belong. And media, commercial media has used this quite effectively. They found ways to get people to understand that if they think it's natural, they probably will be more accepting of what it means. And so Toyota, actually, it is so natural that it actually, it grows itself. It actually grows, natural elements. And so there's this kind of intertextuality that's created when you place one thing next to something else in terms of how does the meaning start to shift and start to become part of those kinds of ideas. Now, young children are inundated with these kinds of things. And I believe that young people are actually quite smart, that they actually know quite a bit about what's going on in the world. But that doesn't mean that they should just be left alone and kind of try to figure this out on their own. They need strategies and ways to do and to look at the kind of the sophistication of these ideas. I also want to just show you real quickly a couple of things that have been done in the very recent past. And so this was a villa that had been unearthed in Italy, and it was going to be at the bottom of a dam, and they were going to lose it. So what they decided to do is they decided that they would excavate it, and then they put it back together in a way that will allow you to actually be there. So this is what the scientists believe this particular villa looks like. They had a really great sound system back then. This is images from the Hubble telescope. And I don't know if you know this, but the Hubble telescope doesn't actually take images. It collects data. It sends the data back. Somebody interprets the data, and then they construct what they think the image looks like. So this is what we think.
I mentioned not only a sight and sound, but a mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone.
Scientists believe that this particular area of the universe looks like. Now, here's the dilemma. It looks so real that you would believe that that's accurate. Right? It looks so believable that it's really hard to understand what it might look like differently from that, right? We've invested so much money in some of these kinds of things that it's very difficult to think about how it is we might think of it differently. And so visualization systems and simulation systems have created a sense of the environment that is oftentimes really hard to think outside of. And what I think we need to do within our schools is to provide students a way to actually question these kinds of things, to not necessarily take them for granted, to think about how it is they might be different. And I watched this show on PBS called The Shape of Life, and the majority of it is all animation. And you would have believed that there was a videographer there at the beginning of the time life emerged on Earth, because it was so believable. And now again, if it looks that believable, are we actually able then to question whether or not those kinds of things can be changed? So another area then that I think is really important for us to maybe think about is how do we talk about information? And I think that these are some terms that are useful for us to deal with information with young people. Information is basically, around human experiences and our perceptual understanding of the meaning of particular content. But propaganda is particular information that's actually trying to persuade you or encourage you to think in a particular way. Misinformation is information that's provided as a way sometimes to get you to think about it, but it's not necessarily accurate or inaccurate. It was misguided. It just was done incorrectly. They didn't necessarily do the homework that they needed. Disinformation is information that's actually intentionally trying to persuade you or to mislead you or to hurt you. And there are times when that happens. And then there is this blank information, which is when information is provided and actually particular parts of it are omitted. And we all know that the Bush administration has gone to great lengths to provide blank information around global warming. I mean, he basically had people within the government go in and cross out information that they didn't want people to know about. So, back to the image. This is part of a website associated with Dow. Sorry. I'm just going to open it up.
For each of us, there's a moment of discovery. We turn a page, we raise a hand, and just then, in the flash of a synapse, we learn that life is elemental. And this knowledge changes everything. We look around and see the grandness of the scheme. Sodium bonding with chlorine, carbon bonding with oxygen, hydrogen bonding with oxygen. We see all things connected. We see life unfold. And in the dazzling brilliance of this knowledge, we may overlook the element not listed on the chart. Its importance so obvious, its presence is simply understood. The missing element is the human element, and when we add it to the equation, the chemistry changes. Every reaction is different. Potassium looks to bond with potential. Metals behave with hardened resolve. And hydrogen and oxygen form desire. The human element is the element of change. It gives us our footing to stand fearlessly and face the future. It is a way of seeing. It gives us a way of touching issues, ambitions, lives. The human element. Nothing is more fundamental. Nothing more elemental.
Dow bought Union Carbide. Union Carbide were the owners of a plant in India, in Bhopal. In 1984, December 3rd, there was a gas catastrophe where basically chemicals were put out into the air, and depending on whose version you read, Union Carbide says about 22 100 people died, and maybe another 10,000 have been injured. If you look at what Dow now says, it's a little bit higher, 3,000 to 4,000 have died, and another 15,000 have been severely injured. And then if you look at what the local people are doing, and this was put together by a group wanting to have their voice fight or combat the kind of publicity that's being put out by Dow. Way over 15,000 people have died, and hundreds of thousands of people have been injured by gas leak. Now Dow uses the analogy that it's kind of like I was on the team and one of my players hit your goalie and gave you a bloody nose, but now I'm the new person that came in. You can't hold me responsible for what one of my teammates did. Well, Dow bought Union Carbide, and then there's been really a long series of actually quite wonderful advances done within the chemical industry worldwide. However, Dow now is back in India, wanting to go into some of the same areas and drill and do excavation of oil and other minerals. And recently, because of these kinds of things, have been stopped. And so using video blogging, using these kinds of opportunities to get their voice out, people have come together in order to fight a very large corporation. Now that has only been recently, and Dow is still back there trying to do things. So the point here, though, I think, is that what we want to do is very, very young, very, very early in our young people's lives, is get them to understand that they should question the kinds of things that are going on in society, that they have a voice, they should exercise their voice. And one of the ways they can do that is to come together collectively using the internet or using other kinds of opportunities through media. And so I think I'm just going to stop right there. Thank you.